Hello, everybody. It is John Pollock here with your post-daily news show for Thursday, June the 16th, alongside WrestleNomics' own Brandon Thurston, who is joining me today. Wei Ting is not here today, but will be back later on. He has both the wellness policy coming up at 3 Eastern today and then MCU later. So a very busy man, and we cap people at 2 shows per day here at Post Wrestling. But joining me is Mr. Thurston. And Brandon, first of all, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. It's been a busy last 24 hours or so since somebody DM'd me and said, "Do you have the article?" I'm like, "What article are you talking about?" Oh my God, there's this huge story from the Wall Street Journal that just came out around 4 o'clock yesterday.
That is right, and that's I believe I hit publish on my news update, and within 30 seconds, this thing drops, and it was oh boy. A big one, obviously, that we are going to be getting into. And we will be taking your super chats if you want to throw in any questions, the ones of which we are capable of answering. This story, obviously, millions of questions coming up, and we'll do our best to kind of recap things for people that are maybe just learning of this story and trying to figure out the details, what all of this could mean, which is going to be very open-ended. But the Wall Street Journal did put out a pretty explosive report on Wednesday, late afternoon, early evening. And the key details are that the board of directors of WWE are investigating a January 2022 settlement involving Vince McMahon and an ex-employee valued at $3 million. This investigation was prompted after an anonymous email from a friend of this ex-employee was sent out to members of the board back on March the 30th. So the investigation began in April. They are utilizing a firm in New York to conduct the investigation and have learned of other non-disclosure agreements involving former female employees making misconduct claims against McMahon and John Laurinaitis that were pegged in the millions of dollars, but they do not have a specific number of NDAs that may exist. This ex-employee is believed to have entered into a relationship with McMahon during her time there and was hired as a paralegal and then received a raise from $100,000 to $200,000. And the preliminary findings are that McMahon used personal funds to pay these former employees, and Jerry McDivitt, who is McMahon's legal representative with K&L Gates, sent a letter to the Wall Street Journal stating that the WWE didn't pay any monies on her departure and referring to the employee alleged to have the relationship with McMahon as one where there were no allegations of harassment from the ex-employee towards McMahon. That's just kind of the broad bullet points, Brandon, and it's a lot to digest immediately. And we've at least had some time now to digest this story and look at it from all angles. What would you say are your biggest questions as we are on, I would say, day 2 of the story and the steps that are to follow? What's kind of jumping out at you as the key points?
What I'm trying to understand, and what I don't have a great answer for, is just what are the limits of the board of directors' power here. As I tried to point out last night and on Twitter to people, Vince McMahon, although he controls about 36% of the stock, so he doesn't control the majority of the shares, he controls the majority of the voting power. So for all intents and purposes, he controls this company. He has the majority of the power because he has a preferred class of shares that makes each one of his shares count 10 times more than anybody else's shares. So Vince controls the company. He's the CEO. He's the chairman of the board, although there are 8 independent members of the board of directors who are apparently behind this investigation. So it's just not clear to me what the limits of their oversight are in a situation like this, where you have a chairman, a CEO, who is part of this, who's a subject of this investigation, and he controls the company. You can't really outvote him. So what's going to be the outcome of this investigation? Let's say, if they find a lot of wrongdoing and they think that Vince should resign, what's to force him to resign? And what are the incentives that the board would even have for doing so unless they knew Vince was going to cooperate and go forward with resigning or with selling the company or whatever it might be? Or are they just going to find that, actually everything's okay here and it's not that big of a deal, and to try to sort of, I don't know, make it look like they did the right thing? But, this could be the beginning of something very big or not. I do have the sense, just sort of thinking this morning about the last 5 years or so that I've been following and covering the wrestling business, especially the business side of the wrestling business. And that maybe, Barrios and Wilson leaving in January 2020 is up there, but this might be the beginning of the biggest story that I've ever covered. Especially if it turns out that there's, if Vince McMahon is no longer in the position that he's currently in at the end of this. So those are my biggest questions right now.
Yeah, I think we have kind of looked at, studying the history of Vince McMahon and scandals that have come this company's way, that there just seems to be a certain level of teflon that Vince McMahon has seemingly been able to have in these situations, that you look at it and we just have this belief, and I mean, you've outlined it, like how insulated Vince McMahon is in this role as chairman of the board, and how many levels of protection are around him to be ousted, which I think people are still like, look at that as just could not fathom that happening. But you read this and I just see so many potential alarm bells, and the idea of picking up that rock and looking underneath it at the history of this company, and if other people could come forward, that there just seems to be many different areas that could explode into catastrophic outcomes. And the idea that nothing comes of this, I certainly am pessimistic on that. It's just, it's hard to see what is going to be the next shoe to drop. And it honestly, one of the most damaging things of all this could come down simply to $100,000 of this raise that this ex-employee received, and if this was a misappropriation of company funds and all of this other stuff, it all boils down to whether this $100,000 was appropriately allocated.
Right, and I've been looking at the code of conduct. I've tweeted a few screenshots of portions from W's code of conduct, which is on their corporate website. And one of the notes that's on it is it's talking about things that all W personnel, which include members of the board of directors, executives, and so forth, aren't allowed to do. And one of them says that W personnel are prohibited from the grant or offer of an employment quid pro quo for personal intimacy. So maybe that's what happened, and maybe that's part of what's being investigated here in terms of what the Wall Street Journal reported. One thing that it reported is that this former paralegal went from having a $100,000 salary to having a $200,000 salary when she began to have an intimate relationship with Vince McMahon. So that's, and I've noticed that that's something that was added to the code of conduct, and I'm going to figure out what the latest version of it that doesn't include that, because looking at previous versions of the W website, looking at the code of conduct within the corporate website, that portion of the code of conduct was not present until about 2020. So that's conspicuous that would be added relatively recently to a document that was otherwise pretty similar across time. You have the minor changes, but that was one of the changes. So that's pretty interesting. I think it'd be good to just point out sort of the timeline of some of these recent events here, in that what we get from the Wall Street Journal article is that an anonymous email was first received by the board of directors on March 30th. Sometime in April, they started their investigation. May 19th, Stephanie McMahon announces that she's taking a leave of absence beginning the following day, May 19th. Then June 3rd, the Business Insider article comes out saying that Vince removed Stephanie because of performance issues. Fightful and others would dispute that. And then June 12th, that is this Sunday, the board of directors, according to the Wall Street Journal report, received a copy of the settlement agreement between Vince and the former paralegal. They received it from Vince's lawyer, according to the Wall Street Journal. And then just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal report came out. So, I mean, that leaves a lot of questions about, here's another big question that I would have is, did Stephanie know? Stephanie's still a member of the board of directors, I've been told, despite taking a leave of absence from being the chief brand officer. So did Stephanie know about this? It seems quite possible that she did, and maybe that played into why she, according to her tweet, took time to spend time with her family and to not work day to day with WWE. So
I'd go further and ask, how could she not have known in April? Like, as a member of the board of directors, that would be really hard for me to imagine she was not aware of this in April before that announcement in May of her stepping away.
Yeah. And I guess you could imagine that maybe there's forces in WWE who are whose interests are opposed to Stephanie's, who may have wanted there to be some publicity saying that, well, she's not really going to spend time with her family. It's really because of performance issues. So I have no sense of what the veracity of that item in the Business Insider is or not, but you could see how somebody who maybe doesn't want Stephanie to get out of this as cleanly might want to have information out there that says otherwise. Just other things that I've noticed is that yesterday W had its highest trade volume since July 15th, 2021. So the most shares changed hands yesterday in almost a year. There was a Morgan Stanley report that came out in the morning raising the price target, and I think that's what's contributing to a lot of the trading. It is conspicuous, though, that all of that trading happened. The market closed, and then just after the market closed, this report came out. So it's reasonable, I think, to question whether or not some people knew about this report and knew this news was going to come out, and that contributed to the trading as well. Guggenheim has raised their price target as well. So, there's perhaps some optimism about the value of the company now if WWE has to sell or is pressured to sell, if Vince is pressured to part with the company as part of the resolution of this investigation. I don't know. I think there's also a perception in that, like, if he has to sell it, if he's pressured to sell it, then there's less leverage because you're getting him to part with something that he has to part with, or he's pressured to part with, as opposed to before yesterday, as far as we knew, he was just Vince who wanted to control the company.
Yes, on Wednesday morning, the stock opened at $65.83, and by several hours later, it had almost grown $2 in value. And now with all of this, it's virtually identical to its Wednesday open. It's trading at last check here at $65.64. So that is where the stock
had a really strong first hour, and then it slid back down to the same degree that the indexes are down today. The WWE stock, by the way, has been one of the few stocks that's doing really well so far year to date, as opposed to the rest of the market.
Yeah, it's been like a pretty consistent climb that we have seen of late with the stock. Do you read anything more into the stock? Is there more to the story today that you glean from, or is it somewhat just hard to decipher what any of this means this early?
There doesn't seem to be anything in the stock activity today that indicates that the market's taking it one way or the other, just because it's down to the degree that basically the Dow Jones is down today. As far as looking at the future and how this might play out, some people asked me last night what are the consequences going to be for WWE? Like, is there a way that their TV deal might be affected, or a way that ads and sponsorships might be affected? And something we've talked about in WrestleNomics before is the hierarchy of influence, in that at the very top there's Vince McMahon, and below that there are, as far as who can actually influence change in the company, there are their business partners. And their biggest business partners are NBC Universal, Fox, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and various sponsors, including Snickers, famous for the Snickers doctrine, for yes, getting WWE to actually change the name of the Fabulous Moolah Battle Royal. So I've asked around, and I've talked to some people about what are some clauses that might come into play here. We don't know, to be clear. We don't know what those contracts look like. Those contracts between WWE and their business partner and their TV partners have never been made public, and they're not going to be made public unless they're part of some discovery in some lawsuit that doesn't exist currently. So there might be, in their TV contract, maybe, something in the realm of a key person agreement, in that it may be a clause in a contract such as WWE's with its TV partners that if Vince McMahon were to die or to be removed from his role in WWE, that maybe there's a clause that would be triggered in that event that would cause the parties to revisit their agreement. That's something that's possible. So we'll see if that plays out. But I hear people talk about the speaking out movement and the Me Too movement. Is this something that could get momentum? And I think back to the 1992 scandals, and Between the Sheets just is in the middle, actually, doing a big review of the 1992 scandals, including the Ring Boy scandal and things like that. And part of what came out in the process of that was the Rita Chatterton allegations of sexual assault by Vince McMahon in 1986. So it's if this is something that gets momentum in terms of being a public story, there are stories that could be revisited. And according to the report in the Wall Street Journal, there are additional agreements besides just the one that involves the former paralegal. There are a lot of stories, and there've been, I think comments made by Lita about how uncomfortable she felt with the live sex segment back in the mid 2000s. So I think there's no shortage of supply of everything from harassment to culture to assault, that if people wanted to come forward and endure the publicity and the public scrutiny and the risk to their careers, these are big ifs, if people want to endure that, this could roll into something bigger. But history has told us, especially when it comes to wrestling, that mainstream media doesn't necessarily take these kinds of stories as seriously when it involves professional wrestling, maybe because of the perception that people have about professional wrestling in the first place.
Yeah, I would certainly echo as well what Brandon said. The Between the Sheets specials, I think, are very important to go back and really contextualize a lot of stories where you may have heard threads of these stories and various pieces of the information, but to have it all gathered together and with the context of this many decades later, looking back on it, I think it all does tie in together in a pretty significant way.
And I had never even heard audio from Rita Chatterton until I listened to that just a week or two ago. I had heard of the Rita Chatterton allegation against Vince McMahon, but I'd never heard the audio or seen the video of the appearances that she made on television in 1992, and it's a compelling and powerful story.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case of when you read these stories versus actually the video or the audio, that I think does resonate with people in a different type of way. When you are looking at this from the perspective of the board members, I think it's going to be natural of asking the question of how this got from a closed investigation into a mainstream outlet, and looking at like the idea of this information coming from a board member, and what kind of penalties even could be attached to that of a board of director potentially disclosing this kind of information. These are questions I don't have an expertise in, but that's a whole other game of how this. There are obviously some games of power that are going on here, and I think we are seeing them play itself out, whether it be in the Business Insider article and this as well. That is certainly, from the outside looking in, that there are games at play here, major ones.
Right. It's a good day to listen to the Succession soundtrack if you have access to it. So according to the Wall Street Journal report, they're attributing these facts to, according to documents and people familiar with the board inquiry. That could mean someone who's a member of the board of directors. The board of directors include 8 independent members of the board of directors who are not executives in WWE, and it includes a few who are, including Vince, who's the chairman, including Nick Khan, including Stephanie McMahon, including Paul Levesque. Mm-hmm. Those are, because I've been looking over this, I don't have it in front of me, but those are the 4 executives who are current members of the board of directors also.
The other 8, I have the list here of Steve Koonin, Ignace Lahoud, Erica Nardini of Barstool, Steve Paimon, Connor Schell, Manjit Singh, Jeffrey Speed, and Alan Wexler would be the 8 independent board members. So that is like your 12-person board of directors that would be the focus of all of this, that are carrying this through. And I mean, the idea that we are even discussing a possible outcome of Vince McMahon out of power, it to me is something that always gets brought up, is the idea of the succession plan. And I don't think we have ever looked at at WWE like this. To me is like at bare minimum, you're looking at this as like, what is our succession plan in a non-Vince McMahon led WWE? And a year ago, I think we would have had a much different outline to sketch than we do now, where Paul Levesque has certainly seen a diminished role in power, where the idea of a Stephanie McMahon taking a step away from her active duties with the company, the situation that she is in, and what a non-Vince McMahon led WWE would look like today. And this might force you to have a concrete plan for your shareholders that are going to have numerous questions beyond what you and I are asking today.
Yeah, I think it would ultimately, if we arrived at a day where Vince was no longer in power at WWE, it would ultimately, I think, be up to the board of directors to appoint a new CEO. I tend to think that that would end up being Nick Khan, but we'll see. We do have, so the calendar quarter will end on June 30th, so that brings to mind that around the end of July, then we'll get another earnings report, and there'll be questions from analysts, and Vince will have an opportunity to comment if he will. So that'll be interesting to see. But yeah, it just raises a lot of questions about why Stephanie left and what she knew, and maybe she couldn't have not known what was going on with her father in terms of the investigation with the board of directors. So, Stephanie owns Class B shares also, so almost all of her shares count 10 times against everybody else's. It is possible, and then this is how Stephanie came to hold Class B shares, is she got them from Vince and Linda. They gifted them to her and to Shane. Shane has since liquidated all of his stocks. He doesn't own any WWE stock anymore. But it's not impossible that, I guess, that Stephanie could end up with Vince's Class B shares somewhere or another. But that a lot of that remains to be seen.
The obvious, subject that is going to get raised in all of this is what, if any, impact this has accelerating people's thoughts on a sale of the company. What position does this put the company in? And at the same time, if you are someone that is kicking the tires on acquiring a WWE, how essential is Vince McMahon being part of this company? And does that scare you off at all? Like, that was a huge part of the UFC sale, was maintaining Dana White in that public-facing position that Dana White needed to come with the acquisition of the UFC. I could see that the idea of purchasing a company and Vince McMahon is somehow viewed as toxic or not part of it, that greatly changes the dynamic, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've always disagreed with this perception that Vince is so essential to the success of the company. Maybe that's from watching the content to the degree that I do, and then I think Vince is a huge negative in terms of being the head of creative, and I can't see things being much worse if someone else was in his place as the head of creative. In terms of corporate strategy, I think he's done a far better job, but also I think he's, it's not like his abilities are tremendously unique. I think in terms of, I don't see why Nick Khan could not navigate the company just as well without Vince. So I think, I've always believed that the company would be better off if he wasn't in power. One of the things that I wrote about last week when I was writing about how I've kind of turned the corner on the argument about whether or not WWE would sell in light of Stephanie's leave of absence is that, the big question to me would be does NBC Universal or /Comcast, which seems like the likeliest acquirer, do they want to oversee a wrestling company in this weird industry that, they don't own anything like a pro wrestling company? You can point back to history and look at Turner Broadcasting / Time Warner's oversight of WCW. That didn't go so well. I guess you've got Anthem there as a parent to another wrestling company that's on a much smaller scale at this point. But does NBC Universal want to oversee a wrestling company, and do they feel like they can do so effectively? And do they just want to add to their brand pro wrestling, the degree to which it's not perceived as highbrow entertainment? And then on top of that, if you add that, well, there's the reemergence of more scandal in the pro wrestling world, specifically surrounding the leader of the company, that makes it less attractive, doesn't it? So, yeah, I think it makes it a little bit less attractive. But I don't know, I had somebody who I trust knows more about the stock market than I do tell me the other day that this is good for the stock because it enhances the perception that there'll be a sale. I'm not sure, though.
Yeah, I just look at this like this story can have many different directions. I would say that the most catastrophic for the company and for Vince would be if this opens up the floodgates of story after story after story, that it forces your partners to just be waving their hands in the air that they do not want, that something needs to be changed here. And Vince McMahon is extremely insulated in his position, and that's why I am always somewhat negative to the idea that someone like that can be impacted. But we have seen major powerful figures fall in the last number of years. And if this becomes this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to other people coming forward, seeing, figures like this being paid out and they have just kept quiet, like this could explode in many ways. It could also be that it's like the aspect of the practices within this company are overlooked, and this strictly becomes was this a gross negligent use of company funds, and that's it. Like that becomes the poison pill in this entire thing. Like it's just, there's so many different directions it can go, and there's also the historical one of somehow Vince McMahon navigates his way out, and this is a hot story for a minute, and then something else takes the attention away. But the fact that a Wall Street Journal is on top of this, I think that gives this a lot of credence that there will be follow-up reporting to it as well, that this doesn't just fall apart. And Vince McMahon is going to be like front and center with this, and with a trial starting next month that we are 30 minutes into the show and have not brought up.
Yeah, and I was given the impression by one of the writers of the Wall Street Journal article that there'll be more reporting. So we'll see. If so, there'll be at least one more mainstream article about this story. But yeah, he's got a trial with Oliver Luck coming up. I'm seeing, I get notifications almost every day related to that, and they do seem to be about to go to trial.
We have a couple super chats here. One is, so is it a given that John Laurinaitis will be the fall guy in this, or is it bigger than a fall guy? And bringing up, we haven't really gone into the Sasha Banks stuff, so I'm not going to go into that at this point. And does Paul Stephanie move on from WWE out of this? Does this affect the view on wrestling products? Okay, so a lot of kind of open-ended questions here, and ones that, I mean, it's kind of hard to look at any definitive conclusions or anyone being removed here. Like this is, as much as we focus on Vince McMahon, John Laurinaitis is tied to this as well, with the notion of past claims of misconduct against both of them, and that's certainly a part of the story that jumps out at you when you see claims of misconduct being alleged.
I think really what determines what happens from here is what the board finds, what they find becomes public, and to what extent the mainstream media takes this seriously and really covers it and gives it a lot of scrutiny. If there's never another mainstream article about this, then it doesn't trickle down in all likelihood to causing trouble with their important business partners. And then the pressure will be far less. But we'll see.
I think you have hit it. I think the Snickers doctrine is the one I look at here, is that ultimately this comes down to pressure for a Vince McMahon to resign, and I think that is going to take I cannot even believe like the pressure it would take. Like this is a company that has really, when it comes to controversies, and this is at a different level, that dig their heels in and they get through the fire and they move on. And I think that was really demonstrated a month after Jamal Khashoggi. They went through with the show, and they faced scrutiny. They faced a stock drop, and they got through it. They got paid for it, and they have gone back, and the criticism has been less and less every time that they've gone. And now we're seeing pretty much golf going through this exact same thing, and it is amazing to hear the commentary that is verbatim what we have been talking about over the last number of years. These same questions, and at the end of it, you have golfers that are going through with this, and they're going to withstand the storm and ultimately get paid.
Yeah. I mean, everything that I've learned about Vince McMahon and the way he deals with public relations problems is that he just tries to ride it out. And like you mentioned, that basically worked in the case of the controversy after the Jamal Khashoggi murder by Saudi agents. They went forward and they had their Saudi events, even though there were reports and rumors that maybe they were going to relocate it, and that never happened. And they just sort of wait it out and ride it out, and it's not so much about moral principles.
Chris Ely writes, "Hey John and Brandon, how comparable is Vince McMahon's situation to Donald Sterling's scandal with the Clippers?" I'll answer this one first. I would say with the Donald Sterling situation, I mean, there was a smoking gun in terms of the audio that made its way public, that there was I didn't think there was any way around it in terms of that scandal. In this one, I view this one differently. Not to say that there couldn't be an outcome where Vince
And
McMahon's...
Sterling was the owner who was caught on tape using racial slurs.
Yes, yeah, some pretty horrific comments made by him, and that was one where I would almost compare that to the Hulk Hogan story, where it was just the evidence was just so damning that there was no way to come back from that. In this one, it's again, it's going to come down to the board's findings, but it is not like we have some, a video of misconduct being shown. That would be a different case. So I don't view them as similar, although outcomes, it's hard to say at this point if they couldn't resemble one another.
I was trying to rack my brain this morning for examples of, like, has there been a CEO who had control of their company in this way, who came under fire and then resigned? And when one case that came to mind was Travis Kalanick from Uber, who, he allegedly he oversaw a lot of sexual harassment and discrimination, and he knew about it and protected people. He's a founder of Uber. He had preferred class shares, but probably through funding, he held such a low number of preferred class shares at that point that he did not control the majority of the votes, and he did resign. I don't know the details of that story, and people can certainly look it up and read more about it. But that is not a perfect case. Vince has the majority of the control of WWE.
I think you took this question on your show on Wednesday night, but Jake is asking about just the idea of Vince McMahon ever taking this company back private. I would seem like that is not any kind of likelihood of happening at this point, and probably not a conclusion that we are going to see here.
So why do companies that are public go private? Because they don't want to have to deliver on shareholder interests, I guess. I don't believe that Vince has enough cash to make that happen on his own. That would be like more than $3 billion in cash. He's got more, probably, I don't know, something like more than $2 billion of net worth, perhaps, but that's not cash. That's largely WWE stock, which is a pile of stock that he would need to add to in order to take it private. So he would have to find investors who want to cooperate with him for what gain? If it's not to make money and to gain market value on the asset that you own, if it's just to sort of protect Vince's activities, I don't know what the incentive would be.
Yeah, I think that there are many different directions you can take this. I can certainly say that just based on the available information that we have, one thing that is very clear to me is just the level of just reckless that this was to engage in a relationship with a subordinate in your company. And you can label it consensual, but I think it certainly does bring into question like this obvious power dynamic that exists here of Vince McMahon over anyone that is working in his company. And there are a reason that companies forbid this type of thing. So at the very least, like, this is reckless behavior that he engaged in by entering a quote unquote consensual relationship with an employee.
And it sounds like this is not the only time that happened, according to the Wall Street Journal article.
Yes. Someone bringing up the CEO of Papa John's being comparable. I'm not super familiar with that particular incident.
I think similar in terms of racial slurs and
that part I knew, but not in terms of the ownership situation. But potentially as well. All right. A lot of people here throwing in different questions, but we are going to wind things down. If you want to listen to more, Brandon and Chris Gullo put up a bonus show on Wednesday night on the WrestleNomics YouTube and Patreon that you can go check out. And do you think you will have enough to talk about this coming Sunday on WrestleNomics?
Oh, I'm sure. Because, I mean, for one thing, like, honestly, I'm trying to learn more about this. I'm going to talk to a few more people who may be able to enlighten and inform my analysis of this. So for sure, we'll have more to talk about on Sunday. Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern, we stream it live on YouTube. And then, of course, you can find the audio on your podcast app, WrestleNomics Radio.
Yes. And again, Wei Ting will be back today at 3 Eastern, chatting about Out in the Ring, the documentary, and he'll be joined by several guests, including Jordan Goodman, his co-host, Neil Flanagan, and the director of the film. So that's coming up later today. MCU later tonight. And we were scheduled to be joined by author Stephen Bell today. He has written the new book on the British Bulldogs. He'll be coming up on Monday after this news drop. So you can look out for that. And of course, you can check out WrestleNomics Radio every Sunday on their feed, as well as here at postwrestling.com. We'll have the latest on this story up at postwrestling.com. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. That will conclude your Post Daily News Show.